I never thought a little sign could cause so much chaos. I mean, really, I bought a small, private property sign, stuck it near the edge of my yard, and felt like I was finally asserting a tiny bit of peace over my own property. I'd been living in my quiet suburban neighborhood for a few years, and while most of my neighbors were decent enough, there was always that tension. Someone's dog barking too much, kids skateboarding on someone else's driveway, the occasional leaf that blew into the wrong yard, nothing huge, just little things that built up. So I thought, why not make it official? A sign should help. It should make people pause, think, okay, this is private, let's respect it. Simple, right? First, nothing happened. I admired the sign for a few hours like a proud parent. It was modest, tasteful even, made of durable wood with neat lettering. My dog Buster sniffed it a few times, clearly unimpressed, and I went inside feeling satisfied. That was until I started noticing the looks. At first, it was subtle. My next-door neighbor, Mrs., peeked over her fence with one eyebrow raised. Then I caught Mr. across the street, whispering into his phone while glancing at my yard. It must be a coincidence, I thought, but it didn't stop there. Within the hour, my email dinged with a message from the HOA. I clicked it, expecting some polite note about landscaping or minor regulations. Instead, I found a carefully worded ultimatum. They accused me of violating community aesthetic standards and warned of penalties and fines if the sign was not removed immediately. I had to read it twice. At first, I laughed. Surely, this was a joke. A sign on my own property couldn't be a crime, could it? But then I noticed the language. It was serious. There were references to bylaws, committee votes, and even a note about potential legal action. I blinked. Legal action over a sign, I muttered to myself. I could feel my pulse starting to rise. I had never been particularly confrontational. I liked my yard, my house, and my peace of mind, and I never imagined I'd be drawn into something that felt this ridiculous. But I also couldn't ignore it. I looked outside, and there was the sign, standing proudly, and I realized it had already become a symbol, not just of private property, but apparently of defiance. Then came the whispers. I swear I could hear them through the windows, the neighbors, walking by my yard, pointing, murmuring. And just when I thought it couldn't get any stranger, the HOA president called. Yes, actually called me on the phone. She was polite, in a "I'm about to rain down administrative fury on you" kind of way. She explained that my sign was not in harmony with community standards, that it could set a dangerous precedent, and that it was apparently trespassing on community expectations. Trespassing on my own property. I almost laughed out loud. I mean, how do you even respond to that? I tried to explain. It's my yard, my property. I checked the city's rules and it's perfectly legal. But she kept cutting me off, citing page numbers in the HOA handbook, referencing meetings I didn't know existed, and speaking in that firm, unyielding tone that makes you feel like you're in a courtroom drama rather than a suburban neighborhood. I could feel my hands shaking slightly as I held the phone. I wanted to stay calm, but I also couldn't help thinking, this is insane. And then she said it. The words I never thought I'd hear. She was calling the police. I froze, my mind spun. The police over a sign, I mumbled to myself. It sounded ridiculous, absurd even, but I knew enough to realize she wasn't bluffing. In the past, this woman had gone to great lengths to enforce the tiniest infractions. And now, my little sign had officially made me the target of an overzealous HOA war machine. That's when I knew this wasn't just about a sign anymore. It wasn't about aesthetics, rules, or community standards. It was personal. And if I wanted my property, my peace, and maybe even my sanity, I was going to have to fight. And I had no idea just how wild, ridiculous, and unbelievably dramatic this fight was about to become. I couldn't believe what was happening. After the call, I sat on my porch, staring at that little private property sign, thinking, this is ridiculous. I'm being punished for owning my own yard. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized it wasn't just a minor inconvenience anymore. The HOA had officially decided that I was their enemy, and apparently the police would be involved if I didn't comply. I opened my inbox again, and as if the phone call wasn't enough, I found another email from the HOA. This one was longer, with bolded sections, threatening language, and a level of bureaucracy I didn't even know existed. They claimed the sign disrupted the visual harmony of the community and was contrary to the established aesthetic values that every resident was expected to follow. I read it twice, then laughed out loud. Visual harmony, I muttered to myself. My yard had a couple of dandelions and a slightly crooked bird bath, but it was hardly the Versailles garden. Still, they were serious. The email ended with a firm demand: remove the sign immediately or face escalating fines, legal action, and community enforcement measures. At that moment, I realized that this was no longer about aesthetics. It was about control, about power, and I was about to find out how far the HOA would go to enforce it. I decided to visit a few neighbors for moral support, thinking at least someone would share in my outrage. Mrs., the next-door neighbor with the ever-raised eyebrow, gave me a sympathetic look but then whispered, "Be careful, she's relentless." Careful, I laughed nervously. Careful, I just got a legal threat over a sign. Mr. from across the street nodded solemnly. "You're not the first one she's gone after," he said. "And probably won't be the last, just watch yourself." I could practically feel the tension, rising like a storm cloud over the neighborhood. Then came the official letter in the mail. This one was thicker, with an official HOA letterhead and a printed signature from the president herself. Reading it felt like opening a secret dossier on some espionage mission. It detailed every violation the sign had caused, including a dramatic list of potential consequences. There were fines that could accumulate daily, notices of hearings I hadn't been invited to, and even a veiled threat about contacting law enforcement if I failed to comply. My jaw dropped. I had entered a world where a simple sign had somehow become the catalyst for a full-blown suburban battlefield. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe they didn't really intend to escalate this. Maybe it was just a formal warning, but deep down, I knew better. There was a stubbornness in the president's tone, a certainty that she had absolute authority over anything within the community, and she was about to prove it. The phone rang again, and yes, it was her. She wanted a friendly meeting face-to-face. The tone was polite, but I could practically hear the underlying menace. I was supposed to sit in an office, listen to her lecture me, and accept the community standards she had invented. The thought made my stomach churn, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. This was no longer optional. The little sign was my hill to die on. So I prepared. I printed copies of property maps, city ordinances, and even researched similar HOA disputes online. I practiced what I would say, though it was hard to imagine staying calm in front of someone who had successfully convinced the police I was trespassing on my own property. I even rehearsed my tone. Polite, firm, calm. I wanted to make sure that if this escalated, I had all the ammunition I needed. As I stood in my living room, looking at the sign through the window, I felt a mix of dread and determination. The neighborhood had turned into something out of a sitcom with too much drama, yet real consequences. I knew the next steps would define how far the HOA was willing to push, and more importantly, how far I was willing to fight back. One thing was certain. This wasn't going to be a quiet little disagreement over a yard decoration. This was becoming an epic suburban showdown. Little did I know, the next knock on my door would bring flashing lights, serious faces, and a level of absurdity I didn't think existed in real life. But that would come soon enough. The day of the confrontation arrived, and I felt a mix of dread and disbelief. I kept telling myself, it's just a meeting. It's just a meeting. But as I pulled into the HOA office parking lot, that familiar sinking feeling returned. The building was small, unassuming, almost cozy, but I knew better. Inside, it was a battlefield disguised as a community hub. I stepped through the door and was immediately hit with the quiet hum of suburban bureaucracy. Chairs neatly arranged, potted plants strategically placed, and the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. And then I saw her, the HOA president, sitting behind a desk that looked far too big for the room. She was reviewing some papers, glasses perched on the tip of her nose, fingers tapping the desk in a rhythm that made my pulse speed up. "Ah, thank you for coming," she said with that tone, the one that mixes fake politeness with the unmistakable scent of superiority. I put my sign down carefully, trying not to show how nervous I was, and nodded. "Of course. I wanted to discuss this calmly," I said, though inside I felt anything but calm. What followed was like something out of a sitcom that somehow got mixed with a courtroom drama. She pulled out a rulebook, thick, leather-bound, and clearly used as a weapon of intimidation, and began reading passages to me. She pointed at every line, claiming that I had disrupted neighborhood harmony and that my sign was a dangerous precedent for future infractions. I tried to follow along, nodding politely, but it was hard not to smirk at some of the claims. Dangerous precedent? Really? I tried to speak. I checked city regulations. My sign is perfectly legal. My property lines are clearly marked. I'm not breaking any laws. But before I could finish, she held up a hand like a judge silencing a defendant. The law is not the only standard here, she said, voice rising slightly. We enforce the community's values above all. I blinked. The values of the community, apparently, included fear of small wooden signs. It got more absurd. She accused me of trespassing on my own property. I nearly laughed out loud, but instead I kept my tone calm. Excuse me, I said, but I believe I am physically on my own land, which I own and have a legal right to occupy. She shook her head, as if my words were a personal attack on her authority. The tension in the room grew, thick enough to choke on. Then came the call. I remember hearing the subtle click of her phone, the hurried mutterings into the receiver, and suddenly the words hit me. She was calling the police. My stomach sank, my mind raced, and for a moment I just froze. The police, over a sign, I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears. This had officially escalated beyond absurdity and into full-blown chaos. The minutes ticked by like hours. I was packing mentally, trying to remain composed while she made dramatic gestures, waving the rulebook, pointing to paragraphs, and listing consequences with the flourish of someone reading Shakespeare with an evil twist. Every so often, she looked at me with that gleam in her eye, the one that says, "You have no idea what you're up against." I realized then that this wasn't just about a sign or even about property rights. It was about control, ego, and proving a point. She wanted me to feel powerless, to bow to the will of the HOA, to accept that my little yard was somehow under her jurisdiction. And I, stubbornly, refused to give her the satisfaction. I kept my voice calm, my tone measured, all while internally calculating my next move. I had evidence, maps, and legal documents ready, but I also knew that the first impression mattered. And just as I thought the meeting couldn't get more surreal, she leaned back, smiled, and said something I will never forget. If you do not remove the sign immediately, we will be involving law enforcement. I froze. My mind raced. I tried to imagine the conversation with the officers, trying to explain that I was being called a trespasser on my own property. The absurdity was almost comedic, but the dread in my chest was real. I left that meeting knowing one thing for sure: the HOA wasn't going to back down. They had officially declared war, and the next step was inevitable. I had no idea what would happen when the police arrived at my door, but I knew I had to prepare. Calm, calculated, and armed with facts, that was my only path forward. As I walked back to my car, I glanced at the little sign still standing in my yard, proud and defiant. It had started all of this, and it would be my symbol of resistance. I just hoped I could survive the next chapter in this suburban nightmare, because things were about to get even more intense. The knock on my door came sooner than I expected. I had barely set down my bag after returning from that surreal HOA meeting when I heard the sound, a firm official rap that immediately put my heart in overdrive. I peeked through the window and saw the unmistakable flash of blue and red lights reflecting off the driveway. My first thought was, this can't be real. They're actually calling the police over a wooden sign. I opened the door and there they were, two uniformed officers standing patiently, slightly confused expressions on their faces. They weren't aggressive, they weren't supposed to be, but there was a certain awkwardness in the air, like they had been drafted into a suburban farce they couldn't quite comprehend. Behind them, the HOA president hovered, looking triumphantly self-satisfied, like she had just won some moral battlefield. "Good afternoon, officers," I said, trying to sound calm, though my stomach had turned into a knot of nerves. "Can I help you with something?" One of the officers cleared his throat and said, "We received a complaint regarding trespassing on private property." His words hung in the air, absurd and surreal. I swallowed hard. Trespassing on my own property? I asked, trying not to sound incredulous. The officer glanced at his partner, then back at me. Yes, that's what the complaint says. I took a deep breath and explained calmly, pointing to the little private property sign standing proudly near the fence. This is my yard. I own the property. The sign simply marks the boundary. I haven't entered anyone else's property, and no one has entered mine without permission. I'm not breaking any laws. The officers exchanged another glance, this one a mix of confusion and disbelief. Right, said one of them, scratching his head. We've never dealt with a complaint like this before. I could almost hear the tiny sigh of relief from them that they hadn't been asked to tackle anything illegal or dangerous. But the HOA president wasn't satisfied. She stepped forward, arms crossed, and began her theatrical explanation of how I had supposedly violated community standards and disrespected neighborhood values. I tried to follow her, but it was impossible not to notice the absurdity. Here I was, standing in my own doorway, defending my right to a wooden sign while she gestured like I had committed a felony. I kept my voice measured. I understand your concerns, I said, but these claims have no legal standing. I have proof of ownership, and the sign complies with all city regulations. The officers nodded politely, still looking at each other like they were in some strange suburban episode of a police procedural show. One of them muttered something under his breath about paperwork and HOA drama, which made me suppress a laugh. I could practically see their brains trying to compute how the criminal in question was actually a homeowner protecting his property. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably just minutes, one officer cleared his throat. Well, it doesn't look like you're doing anything illegal. We'll note the complaint, but there's no action for us to take. Relief flooded me, but I kept my composure. I didn't want to give the HOA president the satisfaction of seeing me panic. She huffed dramatically and muttered something about next time and enforcing rules more strictly. I smiled politely, thanked the officers for their time, and shut the door. For a moment, I just leaned against it, catching my breath. That little sign had created chaos on a scale I couldn't have imagined. The police had come, witnessed the absurdity, and left shaking their heads. I had survived, but I knew this wasn't over. After the door closed, I walked outside to the sign, brushing my hand over it like it had carried me through battle. Buster, my dog, wagged his tail as if sensing my relief. I chuckled, thinking about how my yard had become the stage for one of the most ridiculous dramas of suburban life. I knew the HOA wouldn't back down. They were already plotting their next move, probably drafting more letters, concocting more violations, and preparing for the next scene in this bizarre saga. I sat down on the porch, looking at that little sign in the sunlight. It was more than just wood and paint now. It was a symbol of resistance, a reminder that sometimes you have to stand up, even when the battle seems absurd. And standing there, I realized I was ready for whatever came next. The HOA had officially escalated things to the police, but they hadn't broken me. If anything, the whole encounter had strengthened my resolve. I wasn't going to let them intimidate me, and I had a feeling that the next move in this suburban war would be even crazier, even more ridiculous, and probably even more dramatic than anything that had happened so far. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to back down. That night, after the police left and the HOA president had stormed back to her lair, her office, I finally let myself breathe. But it wasn't relief, it was determination. I realized that if I wanted to survive this suburban battlefield, I needed a plan. And not just any plan, a legal, airtight, foolproof plan that would put the HOA in its place. I turned my living room into a miniature war room. Papers, maps, and my laptop were scattered across every available surface. I dug through property records, HOA bylaws, municipal codes, and even old city ordinances. At first, it was overwhelming. Legalese that sounded like a foreign language, references to obscure paragraphs, and cross-references that looped back into other cross-references. I sipped my third cup of coffee and muttered to myself, is this really happening over a wooden sign? But as the night went on, I started connecting the dots. The sign wasn't just legal, it was untouchable if I had the right documentation. My property lines were clearly marked. City codes supported my right to post signage. And most importantly, the HOA bylaws, despite their dramatic language, had loopholes that completely undermined their threats. I felt like a detective uncovering a secret conspiracy, only instead of international espionage. It was suburban power dynamics and lawn aesthetics. I even made a timeline. Every interaction with the HOA, every letter, every call, every threat, it all went on paper. I wanted to be ready should this escalate to a formal hearing or court scenario. And if they thought they could intimidate me with phone calls or flashing blue lights, they were in for a surprise. I was ready to fight back, armed with facts, evidence, and a stubborn streak that refused to bend. Then came the neighbor factor. I knew I couldn't do this entirely alone. Quietly, I started talking to a few trusted neighbors, those who had witnessed the absurdity firsthand or had themselves been on the receiving end of the president's theatrics. They were sympathetic, some even amused, but mostly supportive. I shared my plan with them carefully, knowing how quickly gossip could spread. A few nods, a few reassuring smiles, and I felt bolstered. I wasn't the only one fed up with this ridiculous display of power. I also had to mentally prepare. I had to anticipate the next moves, the dramatic claims, the empty threats. The HOA president had proven she was capable of going to extremes, escalating issues that should have never existed. I imagined the next meeting, the dramatic hand gestures, the raised voices, the self-important references to obscure rules. I practiced my tone in the mirror, calm but firm, ready to deflect absurdity with logic. Humor became my secret weapon. I couldn't take this too seriously or I'd go insane. I imagined the scenario in my head, the officers arriving, reading the complaint about trespassing on one's own property, shaking their heads and quietly muttering, "Not again." I pictured the president standing in front of the neighborhood with her dramatic rulebook, expecting an obedient bow from me, and me standing there, calm, polite, armed with facts and a little smug satisfaction. That mental rehearsal gave me courage. By the end of the night, I had a strategy. Documentation ready, allies quietly lined up, mental composure rehearsed, and humor intact. I knew the HOA wasn't just going to roll over, they thrived on intimidation and drama, but I also knew I wasn't backing down. This was no longer a private property sign, it had become a symbol of resistance, a way to assert my rights, and frankly, a little bit of suburban justice. As I finally put my coffee cup down and looked out the window at the little wooden sign proudly standing against the fading twilight, I felt ready. I wasn't going to let the HOA bully me, misinterpret the law, or drag me into endless bureaucratic chaos. I would fight, and I would win, or at least make them regret underestimating me. And I had a feeling that the next HOA meeting, when I presented my evidence and calmly exposed their overreach, would be one for the history books, complete with dramatic reactions, gasps, and perhaps a little embarrassed silence. The next chapter was coming, and I couldn't wait to step into it, armed with facts, courage, and just enough humor to survive the absurdity. Because if the HOA thought a little sign would scare me into submission, they had another thing coming. The day of the big HOA meeting arrived, and I felt a mix of nerves and determination. I knew I had done my homework, but facing the president and her self-appointed entourage in their territory was another level of intimidation. I reminded myself, calm, confident, and armed with evidence. I wasn't just defending a sign, I was defending my right to own my property without being harassed over a little piece of wood. I walked into the community center, folding chairs lined up in neat rows, the air thick with whispered conversations. Some neighbors were watching curiously, others with quiet amusement, and a few looked downright anxious. The president was already there, seated at the front, surrounded by her inner circle. She gave me a smile that was anything but friendly, a combination of superiority and anticipation. I took a deep breath and carried my folder of documents to the front. She began immediately, pointing at me like I was a criminal on trial. "We're here today to address a serious violation of our community standards," she said, voice dripping with authority. "The sign in question has caused distress among neighbors and threatens the harmony of our neighborhood. I fought the urge to roll my eyes. Distress. Threatening harmony. I looked around, and everyone else seemed to be holding back smirks. I spoke calmly, presenting my case piece by piece. Property lines, city ordinances, documented communications, and the absurdity of the trespassing claim. I laid out the facts clearly, confident that the evidence was undeniable. "This sign is on my property," I said firmly. "It's legal. It's documented. There is no violation of any law or HOA statute that can justify its removal." The president scoffed, flipping through her thick binder of rules and regulations like a magician pulling rabbits out of a hat. She tried to find a loophole, a technicality, anything to counter my argument. Her face grew redder as I calmly dismantled each claim. Paragraph by paragraph, threat by threat, I methodically showed why her complaints were baseless. I could see her confidence wavering. I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind, desperately trying to salvage some semblance of authority. Neighbors were shifting in their seats, some nodding quietly, others exchanging glances that said, finally, someone standing up to her. The tension in the room was palpable, but it was different now. Instead of being a one-sided confrontation, it felt like the room was finally weighing the absurdity of the HOA's actions. And I had the upper hand, armed with logic and facts. Then she made a last-ditch effort. "Even if all of this is technically true," she said, her voice rising, "it is still disruptive. The sign undermines community cohesion and cannot be tolerated." I paused, letting her words sink in for the audience, literally and figuratively. "Disruptive," I repeated, maintaining calm. "If a sign that clearly marks private property is disruptive, then perhaps the definition of cohesion needs reevaluation. I'm not breaking any laws. I'm not harming anyone. I'm protecting my property, just like every homeowner has the right to do." There was a moment of silence, the kind that stretches long enough to feel dramatic, cinematic even. The president's hands shook slightly as she tried to flip through her binder one last time. I could see the frustration mounting. The theatrics she relied on to intimidate me were faltering in the face of evidence and reason. And then the unexpected happened. A few neighbors spoke up. One quietly mentioned that they appreciated the clarity of the sign. Another, more boldly, said that everyone should be able to mark their property as they see fit. The room started murmuring agreement. Suddenly, the president's dramatic authority began to crumble. She tried to regain control, but her words sounded hollow, her threats ineffective. By the end of the meeting, I walked out feeling triumphant, though I stayed polite. This wasn't about gloating. The sign was safe, my rights were intact, and the HOA had finally been confronted with the reality that their overreach had limits. I looked at my little wooden sign on the way home and smiled. It wasn't just a sign anymore. It was a symbol of resistance, of standing up to bureaucracy gone too far, and a reminder that sometimes the simplest things can spark the most ridiculous, yet satisfying, victories. As I closed the door that evening, I knew one thing for certain. The HOA wouldn't stop trying to assert control. They were already plotting their next move, probably drafting more letters or imagining new violations. But I was ready. Calm, prepared, armed with facts, and with a healthy dose of humor, I knew I could handle whatever absurdity they threw at me next. And somehow, I couldn't help but laugh at the thought that all this chaos had started with a little wooden sign. Just when I thought the HOA meeting had ended, and that the sign had won a temporary reprieve, I quickly realized this wasn't the end. Oh no, the president had more tricks up her sleeve. I started receiving emails almost immediately, each one more absurd than the last. Fines that seemed to multiply by the minute, vague community action threats, and ominous hints about legal consequences if I didn't comply. It was like she was testing me, trying to see how far I would bend before finally snapping. I couldn't help but laugh. Really laugh. The mental image of her drafting these letters with a dramatic flourish, imagining herself as the ultimate arbiter of moral and aesthetic law, was too much. I pictured her packing back and forth in her living room, waving a pen like a sword, muttering to herself about the sign that dared exist on my property. And somewhere in that image, I could see the officers from the previous visit shaking their heads, wondering how a private wooden sign could possibly trigger this level of chaos. But behind the humor was a sharp edge of reality. The HOA wasn't just playing games, they were serious about escalation. They were gathering neighbors, creating a paper trail, and planning to use every imaginary rule in their arsenal to intimidate me. They had underestimated me, though, and that would soon become painfully obvious to them. I started documenting everything meticulously. Copies of emails, records of phone calls, photographs of the sign, maps of my property lines, even notes on the neighbors' reactions. Every detail could be used to demonstrate the absurdity of their claims and to protect myself legally if things got out of hand. The next warning letter arrived, hand-delivered this time, which struck me as almost comical. The president had the audacity to stand there and lecture me about community standards while waving her binder like it was a weapon. I listened politely, nodded in all the right places, and internally rolled my eyes. The theatrics were impressive, I'll give her that, but they didn't intimidate me anymore. I had spent weeks researching, preparing, and rehearsing my responses. I knew every loophole and every rule they might try to exploit. I could feel the tension rising every time she spoke, but it was balanced by the growing support of my neighbors. They were tired of the endless drama, the petty rules, and the overreach of the HOA president. A few of them whispered encouragement, small nods and subtle gestures that said, "We've got your back." Their quiet solidarity gave me strength, and I realized that the absurdity of this situation was slowly turning into a lesson in resilience. Then came the most ridiculous moment of all. She threatened to file a complaint that I was somehow harboring illegal signage and that my actions could result in community-sanctioned removal of the sign. I blinked. Illegal signage? Really? I had to pinch myself to make sure I wasn't dreaming. I imagined the scene if this went any further. A SWAT team of HOA volunteers arriving at my doorstep, armed with clipboards and measuring tapes, ready to confiscate a wooden sign. The image was hilarious, but it underscored just how far she was willing to push this conflict. I kept my composure and calmly responded to each escalation. I cited city ordinances, property laws, and clearly documented ownership rights. I prepared letters, gathered witness statements, and even sketch diagrams showing the exact location of the sign in relation to property boundaries. Every threat from the HOA was met with evidence and reason, and with every exchange, I could feel their authority weakening. They had built their power on intimidation and absurdity, but I had something they didn't: the truth on my side. By the end of that week, I realized a critical truth. The HOA had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't intimidated. I wasn't flustered. I wasn't going to remove the sign or bow to their demands. The drama they had tried to create had only strengthened my resolve. Every over-the-top letter, every threat, every theatrical warning was met with calm, meticulous documentation and a growing confidence that I could outlast them all. As I looked out at the sign, standing proudly in the fading light, I felt a sense of quiet triumph. It wasn't just a piece of wood in the yard anymore, it was a symbol. A symbol that bureaucracy and ego could be challenged, that absurdity could be met with reason, and that no amount of overreach could intimidate someone prepared to stand their ground. The final showdown was approaching, and I was ready to see the HOA learn, perhaps the hard way, that some homeowners simply don't back down. Finally, the day came when it all ended. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, satisfying realization. I had won. The HOA had exhausted their threats, their letters, their dramatic phone calls, and even their hand-delivered lectures. Every attempt to intimidate me had been met with evidence, logic, and a calm that seemed to rattle even the most self-assured among them. My little private property sign stood in my yard like a flag of victory, unbowed and unbroken. Final meeting was anticlimactic, in the most satisfying way possible. The president arrived, confident as ever, only to find that her carefully rehearsed theatrics no longer worked. I calmly presented a summary of the weeks-long saga: city ordinances, property boundaries, neighbors' statements, and copies of every ridiculous threat she had made. I spoke slowly, clearly, and with unwavering confidence, knowing that the audience, the other board members, and a few supportive neighbors was watching closely. Her attempts at theatrics fell flat. She tried to wave her rulebook to dramatize clauses to make ominous gestures, but by this point, everyone had heard it all. The members of the board exchanged awkward glances, unsure of how to respond. I could practically hear them thinking, maybe we've been overdoing this. For the first time, the president didn't look in control. She looked flustered, frustrated, and slightly defeated. I kept my tone polite but firm. This sign is on my property. It is legal. It complies with city codes. There is no violation of HOA rules that allows for its removal. The claims made against me have been disproven repeatedly. I let a brief pause hang in the air, dramatic enough for effect. The room was quiet. You could have heard a leaf drop. And then the most satisfying moment. A neighbor spoke up calmly but firmly. I support the homeowner. The sign is within their rights and it does not disturb our community. Another nodded in agreement. Slowly, the room shifted. Even some of the president's inner circle seemed unsure of how to respond. Her power, built on intimidation and exaggerated threats, had crumbled under the weight of facts and reason. At that point, she tried one last move, muttering something about potential legal escalation and next steps, but her words fell flat. The tension that had been building for weeks evaporated. She was out of ammunition. I realized in that moment that the battle was over. I had won, not through anger or confrontation, but through preparation, persistence, and a refusal to be intimidated by absurdity. Walking back to my yard afterward, I looked at my little wooden sign and felt a rush of pride. It had started as a simple marker of my property, but had grown into a symbol of resilience, reason, and quiet rebellion. Neighbors waved as I passed, some with smiles, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the whole saga, but all recognizing the small victory. I imagined them telling the story at block parties. Remember the sign? Yeah, that was a saga. Buster, my dog, wagged his tail as if he had known all along this day would come. I chuckled, realizing that in some strange way, this little suburban battle had given me stories to tell, lessons in persistence, and a renewed sense of confidence. I didn't just win a dispute over a sign. I had stood up to bureaucracy, ego, and absurdity, and I had come out unscathed. The HOA, of course, would recover. They'd find new rules to enforce, new letters to send, and perhaps new residents to target. But for me, the victory was complete. I had reclaimed my yard, my rights, and my sanity. The drama that had consumed weeks of my life was over, replaced with quiet satisfaction and a well-earned sense of humor about the entire ordeal. That night, I sat on my porch, looking at the sign bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. It was more than wood and paint. It was proof that standing your ground matters, that preparation and patience pay off, and that even the most ridiculous conflicts can end with justice. I leaned back, took a deep breath, and smiled. The HOA had learned, perhaps the hard way, that some homeowners simply don't back down. And as for me, I finally felt at peace. My property, my rules, my sign, untouched and triumphant. And somewhere in the neighborhood, I imagined the president muttering to herself, wondering how a simple wooden sign had turned into the greatest drama of her HOA career. I laughed quietly to myself, knowing that in this little suburban war, I had emerged victorious. The sign would stay, my rights were intact, and life would go on, slightly more humorous, a little more dramatic, and infinitely more satisfying. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.